Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here tonight. The Office of Strategic Services is a league of extraordinary men and women. And I had the privilege and honor of interviewing about 600 of those men and women over the course of the last 25 years. I've interviewed about 4,000 World War II veterans and veterans of other wars, including Korea and modern warfare. But one of the toughest interviews and the toughest people that I ever met was an OSS veteran. And his name was Howard Wheeler Chappell. And Chappell was extraordinary. And every time I would try to go interview him, he would say, well, Pat, you just have to come out here. And it was kind of a throwaway line. He never wanted to talk to me. Finally, I cornered his case officer during World War II. His nickname was the Brain. And the Brain was a guy by the name of Albert Materazzi, who ran the Italian section of the operational groups in northern Italy. These were 15, 16-man teams that were dropped behind the lines in the most dangerous part of Nazi Germany. And they had to survive against the SS. And the Brain was good friends with Chappell and sort of knew what to say. And whenever I'd go over to the Brain's house, we'd go to his basement, and he had massive filing cabinets of all these World War II files that had only been recently declassified. Most of the OSS story had been hidden and declassified until the 80s and 90s, and some of it still is. But he talked to Chappell, and he said to him, talk to this guy. And Howard, I called him up when I got to San Francisco, and I said, Howard, I'd like to talk to you. He's like, well, you have to come out here. I'm like, I'm here. And then I had the Brain call him as sort of like the reinforcement. And he said to me after the second call, Pat, meet me at the gas station, the Shell station at Spyglass Hill Drive at noon tomorrow. No problem. I got there at exactly 11:55. A large Lincoln Continental, dark blue, pulls up. Guy with sort of sunglasses, window rolls down. It's like, O'Donnell? Yep, follow me. Went back to his house, and he's like, you need to go to the bathroom or anything? It was immediate intimidation tactics. Pulls out his Fairburn Sykes fighting knife, which he carried during World War II, starts opening up the mail, has these nails that are like Count Chocula. And they're long, he's picking his nails with the dagger. And I said to him, Howard, do you remember the man that you killed at the Bushy Bridge? He's like, yeah. I don't know if I killed him with a ski pole or a silenced pistol. I'm like, I knew right away we're going back to the war. And that's what we did. We started to talk about World War II and his mission behind the lines. And it was extraordinary. His first he's in the middle of northern Italy, in the middle of nowhere, and it's right after Christmas, January time frame, and the SS had pulled off an entire battalion off the line to do what's known as a ristallamento, and they would flush out any of the partisans or the OSS operatives that were there, a small team, which was headed by Chappell. And the entire countryside was swept with SS men with machine guns and dogs. And his team was flushed out of their safe house. And he operated what was known as a Browning automatic rifle. As he was peppering the SS that were trying to overrun his house, he was running for his life. And these men were running down a stream that was frozen. And they were being chased by the SS and dogs. Several of the men literally hid in small cubby holes in the side of the stream and covered themselves in mud as the SS were trying to find them. And in one situation, one of the SS operatives, literally, they poked a bayonet into the hole, and the man grabbed the bayonet and the rifle with his bare hands, and the guy tried to pull it back, and he let go. At that point, he pounced on him and killed him with a knife. Howard was then pursued by an SS group and was captured. And it was there that I asked him about one of his incidents. I said, what happened when you pulled out? He had a ballpoint pen that actually doubled as a .22 caliber pistol. And he pulled out the pen And the guy was like, what the hell? Yeah, it's like almost like, what the hell? And he fired his Mauser rifle as Howard was running away like a racehorse, and it grazed the back of his shin. And I said, do you still have that scar? And he pulled up his leg, and the scar was there. And that was kind of the beginning of his experience there, but it was also the story of some of these extraordinary men and women who were the OSS. The Office of Strategic Services begins its story in 1941 in another name by something called the Coordinator of Information. In 1941, in the summer of 1941, the United States didn't have a centralized intelligence service, nor did it have special operations forces. None of this stuff existed at the time. And just prior to that, the existence of the Coordinator of Information, it's quite an interesting story. The writer of James Bond novels, Ian Fleming, and another guy by the name of Admiral Godfrey came to the United States to ostensibly talk about port security, when in reality, they were there to urge President Roosevelt to create a centralized type of an intelligence agency along with special operations forces. And Fleming handed William Donovan a 2-page document, which was kind of a shell of what this organization might look like. Donovan took some of those ideas, but also created his own organization. And with an executive order, the Coordinator of Information was born, and with it, also Special Operations Forces. And Donovan didn't look really necessarily at the British, but he looked back at America's own legacy, which is rich in special operations history. But he wasn't looking back in World War I because special operations didn't exist there. He looked all the way back to the Civil War, and he was looking back at a group called the Jesse Scouts and Mosby's Rangers and the Confederate Secret Service and others. And that is sort of the genesis of American Special Operations Forces. But the organization itself is layered in multiple departments. And I'll sort of give you a little bit of a thumbnail of what they are, and then drill down into a couple of them, and then get into some of the missions themselves, which are really unique and interesting. The first part of the OSS that's very unique for a military intelligence organization at the time was something called the Research and Analysis Division or branch. And this was groundbreaking for its time. The British themselves didn't even have it, which were considered by far sort of the gold standard in intelligence at the time. What they had is RNA leaned on Donovan's experience. And let me just sort of back up a second. William Donovan was one of the most decorated soldiers in World War I. He received the Distinguished Service Cross and the Medal of Honor for his valor in the 69th Division. And then he was an extremely successful lawyer on Wall Street, and he was also very active in the Republican Party. He was a campaign chair in many things at that time. But Roosevelt leaned on Donovan for his experience and his valor and his just smarts and his contacts to create this organization. And he has to come up with all of the things that are needed. And one of the things he comes up with is the Research and Analysis Division, which is he takes the best professors in the United States that specialize in things that are related to the war effort, and he brings them into the OSS. This is kind of the chairborne division. 800 or 900 of the greatest scholars on history of Poland, Romania, whatever, logistics in Europe. And all of these great minds are put together to analyze things. They're analyzing the raw data that the agents are getting, that are bringing in. But they're also doing things like analyzing the objectives that bombers need to take or on targets in Nazi Germany, which in itself was fairly novel. There was an enemy objectives unit which was looking at the oil production of the Third Reich and where those critical choke points were, those nerve centers, and where to bomb, which they were highly successful at. They also looked at something as mundane as a serial number on a tank. And if you ever had a Luger pistol, you know that every single part on that pistol is numbered with a serial number. tanks are similar in the German army during World War II. Through those serial numbers, they were able to divine when the tank was made and then part of the order of battle of where it was placed in North Africa or wherever it was fighting. So with these little mundane tidbits of information, they were able to piece together entire mosaic of intelligence. So moving along within the sort of this umbrella of the OSS, or Coordinator of Information at this time, you have another interesting unit or branch called the Research and Development Branch. This is Q's laboratory. And a guy by the name of Stanley Lovell, who's kind of a mad scientist, runs it. And they develop all kinds of fascinating and important weapons of war that'll be used in spycraft. Everything from the .22 caliber pen pistol that Howard used, to a piece of exploding coal that somebody can throw, a coal tender can throw into a furnace in a locomotive to blow it sky high, to limpet mines, to something called the Joan Eleanor, which was a walkie-talkie type device that allowed an agent on the ground to talk to a Mosquito British airplane in the air. And this becomes the technology behind cell phones many, many years later. They had something called the Java Man, which allowed a television set to be inserted into a guided missile and guide the missile. And then it gets into some of the more wacky stuff. And I'll never forget, I spent literally 20 years at the National Archives, mining the archives to write effectively 5 books on the Office of Strategic Services. And the archives, it's kind of like drilling for oil. Sometimes you get lucky, and then sometimes you don't. And one day, I'll never forget, I found a file that had a rusted little paper clip, and it said, "The Truth Drug." I'm like, oh, this ought to be interesting. And it talked about a detective from New York City that was testing a specialized drug that the OSS R&D branch had developed to make people talk. And they used, the main ingredients was TCH, which was, basically behind cannabis. And they put it in a liquid form and injected it into cigarettes and other things. And the man that they used was this detective from New York City, and he tested it on a man who was a known mobster. And I'll never forget, I'm reading this thing, and it says, he spilled the beans. And it talked about all the things that he revealed in their conversation, which he didn't know he was doing, which was illegal. But it's still a very fascinating story behind some of the things that the OSS was doing. Moving along, they have something called the Morale Operations Unit, which is psychological warfare, which at the time was groundbreaking. And this is everything from radios that were broadcasting to, all of Europe, where they brought in Marlene Dietrich, for instance, to broadcast to German troops propaganda that were part of the, pro-Allied propaganda, to something called Operation Sauerkraut. And this is a fascinating story where I'll never forget, I interviewed 70-something Barbara Lars at this time, and she was just a beautiful lady that talked about how she would go into prisoner of war cages to interview people for her mission, Sauerkraut. And they went in there and they tried to find people that were against the Nazi effort. And what they were doing was they were getting them to take propaganda and disseminate it behind the lines, these former German soldiers. And in some cases, and they did do that, and it was effective. Other things are pretty wild and novel. Operation Cornflakes, for instance. They wanted to infiltrate the German Reich's mail system. And what they did is they came up with the same mail bag that the Reich post office used, and then they put letters in there that were propaganda and addressed to German residents, real addresses. And they infiltrated that through either agents or then, remarkably, they would find out when the timetable was for trains that were carrying German mail, literally strafe the train, and then some of the planes that were strafing the train also bombed, instead of bombs, mail bags filled with this fake mail.